Welcome back, everyone. So our next panel is called That's Not What I Meant, Addressing Bias in Emergency Medicine. And we have a great panel selected for you guys. And to moderate this panel, we have two Stanford emergency medicine physicians. The first is Jennifer Newberry, the consummate overachiever. She's one of those MD, JD people that is a double threat. And then she also does all kinds of amazing work with international medicine and addressing bias, and she just does everything. I don't know how she has time for it all, and she's made time for us to moderate our session here today. In addition, we have Christian Rose. He's an emergency medicine physician, as well as a informaticist, clinical informaticist. Am I pronouncing that right? Who's also going to help us lead our discussion here today. And I will let them introduce the rest of our panelists. Thank you, Jennifer and Christian, for being with us today.
Thank you, Jason, for the very kind words. Super excited to moderate this panel with Christian. And we have really fantastic people joining us today. And I'm not sure if they've turned on their cameras or if they'll pop on, Jason, if you'll help them with that. But we have joining with us, we have well, first, we'll start off with Sarah Gerke, who is a fellow at the Harvard Petrie-Flom Center, working specifically on precision medicine, AI, and law. And she'll be joining that group soon to be also, I believe it's Dr. Gerke, hopefully in the summer, I believe. And it's as an assistant professor where she continues to focus on ethical and legal challenges in AI and big data. We also have Dr. Mark Diaz joining us. He is a research scientist on Google's ethical artificial intelligence team, and he focuses on social bias in data sets and the influence of that on algorithmic performance. And finally, we have Dr. Anthony Rios, who's a picture I can't quite see yet, but I'm sure he'll be joining us on the screen soon. There he is. Thank you, Dr. Rios. He's an assistant professor from UT San Antonio in the Department of Information Systems and Cybersecurity, and he focuses on biomedical and social applications of machine learning and natural language processing. So thank you all for joining us. We are super excited for all the experience and insights you bring to this panel. So I'll hand it off to Christian.
All right. Yeah, thanks, guys, for being here. This is super exciting. Thanks, Dan, and the whole StEMI X team for putting this together. So far, we've heard some great discussions. I think, just on the last one before here, how we're going to utilize the leverage the emergency department to actually bring about change, and how we can invest and see those investments grow to change medicine. One of the things that comes up with that, as we change the focus a little bit in this session, is in emergency medicine, we have a lot of information needs. We learn about patients who we've never met before at the point of care. We have to make judgments in a split second based on perceived needs, what their life story is like, and do all this immediately at the bedside. So it's a particularly great place, as the last groups talked about, for information technology interventions, where we can summarize data, we can help make recommendations, and we can do and provide the best care for the right patient at the right time, every time. The unfortunate thing to that is that as we try to make this process faster and easier, we sometimes begin to lose the nuance and the depth that actually belies the bigger issues at stake when we ask these questions. And so we're stuck with this sort of tension of trying to do things faster, easier, cheaper, but also trying to recognize that we have an N of one, a patient and an individual in front of us, and that we also, as physicians, bring different biases and assumptions to the table when we provide care. So each of the different speakers here today are going to, you've heard some of their talks already, but we're going to try to investigate those themes a little deeper here in this session. So I'll start with the first question, which we'll go in the order. I'll ask this to the group, then Mark, if you can respond, followed by Sarah and Anthony, and then we can sort of round table from there. But because this is such a weird, sort of amorphous concept, and lots of people bring different assumptions to it, when you think about bias and innovation, what are you thinking about, Mark?
Yeah, I think for me, I often think about kind of actually turning away often from the term innovation, only because I feel like it gets really wrapped up in sort of what's new, what's novel, what hasn't been done before. And so many issues with bias have to do with poor dissemination of things that already exist, poor data on things that we might think we know enough about. And so for me, the starting point is thinking about how can we optimize the things that we already have? How can we make sure that we're using them effectively? And how can we make sure, I'm really focused on data and data sets. And so I'm really interested in thinking about some of the problems that we think we've checked off or that we've made lots of headway on, who still hasn't been on the receiving end of those benefits of those innovations. And so I push back a little bit on focusing too much on innovation when I start thinking about bias.
Great, that's a great thought. Do you have a specific example maybe? And then we'll shuttle it over to Anthony about one area that you think was a particularly good one of what people thought was like, we're done with that. And then you're like, actually, maybe we need to reassess.
Yeah, I do have, it might feel like a bit of a random example, but before I was doing my current research, I was involved in a research project on internet access. And internet access isn't like a sexy problem to many people, but I was working in Chicago at the time, and internet penetration in Chicago is around 80%. That means 20% of people in Chicago, a city of about 3 million people, don't have home broadband access. And you might think like, whoa, wild, like how is that possible? Yeah, it's a huge problem, and not enough, this sort of like framing of innovation and doing new things and working on like the hot new problem has this unfortunate side effect where issues like internet access just aren't sexy to folks or to whole industries.
Totally. It's one of the things I saw actually as an example for me is in Indian health services. Some of my medical school time was spent in the Southwest, and as we push the limit in New York City, where I was doing my training, and in San Francisco, and we're thinking, oh my God, 5G, what are the problems we're already going to face in the future, which is a big issue. You're forgetting that 1 in 5 people or entire communities don't have the basic access that we all take for granted, which effectively leaves them behind. So that's a really interesting way to flip that question. I like that a lot. Anthony, what do you, same initial question over to you, just generally when thinking about bias, what are you thinking about, and equity and all of these sort of concepts? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark's kind of answer is pretty great. So for my line of research, I usually focus on 2 groups, like biomedical NLP researchers, but also like data scientists, people that actually apply like natural language processing and machine learning in their day-to-day jobs. This could be people like working at hospitals or maybe in industry that are developing new applications that are used in hospitals. And so when I'm thinking about innovation, I'm thinking about kind of how I innovate maybe towards those specific groups. And a lot of the innovation come from similar types of areas. One is in education. Can we innovate by basically educating new researchers, new data scientists, on the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a lot of times even in coming up with or teaching them how to, evaluate systems with regards to bias, like value-sensitive design and other types of techniques like that. Another area that I think about in terms of innovation is in terms of innovating in terms of tools and techniques. So and kind of, I follow a lot of the same line of thought as Mark, where I think we're always focusing on like SOTA or improving performance when there's been so many new methods, we don't really understand how they perform per se. So the idea is making inclusive and kind of equitable evaluation methodologies for NLP and machine learning kind of a part of everyday researchers and data scientists' job. So make it more of a standard there. And to do that, really, we need kind of innovation in how we evaluate real-world systems. How can we make it easier for data scientists at a company to maybe actually evaluate, to get them motivated to evaluate bias in these systems? Because they maybe a single data scientist at a startup company, is working on 100 different things, right? But if you want them to actually focus on bias on this one thing that they're applying, yet it's going to have an impact on people, maybe we need to think about how to make it easier for them to do that. Also, in terms of like innovating in terms of methodology. So as an NLP researcher, like sometimes there's a lot of work on developing unbiased systems or NLP systems. I'm not really sure if that's completely possible. I don't think so. But I think in terms of thinking about unbiased systems, we should not be afraid to kind of move away from this end-to-end system design or this one-size-fits-all paradigm where a lot of people are focusing on that, and that's what's getting published, but more like specific solutions to specific communities and more, I think can have a lot of benefit there. And also in terms of the applications, innovation in terms of applications, like how do we select the problems, right, that we actually want to work on that can empower people to participate and actually can create positive change. And with that, I think there's innovation in terms of like how we design new tasks or how do we start new application processes. And there's a lot of work there being done now that's innovating in this area with participatory research. So the idea is involving stakeholders in the design process itself, right, and kind of making this standard rather than just focusing on this one metric, I want to improve on this one metric and that's it, but actually getting them involved in the design process from the beginning can help us make sure we're attacking the right problems.
Totally. Those are the two big pieces I take from that, which really apply to emergency medicine projects, even that I've worked on. The first one is physicians, emergency physicians, I'm sure people in the audience of all sorts are used to dealing with like confidence intervals. And we're used to dealing with understanding whether or not we'll look at the characteristics of our study participants, whether they're representational for our group. Every journal club like we've ever done has had us do that. For some reason, we're all kind of like, ooh, shiny new thing many times, not everybody, but we forget that like we have these skills and we should be making them normal practice. We learned them in medical school. There'll be a new way to do it as we approach these sort of new models. And I also, the other piece to that is really that participatory research. A lot of talk, and there even would have been one of the interesting things for this conference generally, is design thinking. One of those main pieces is really understanding the problem first and who the stakeholders are, as opposed to the hammer looking for nails approach, which I think, a lot of medical innovation sometimes is we can do this, and that's exploratory and awesome. But we also need to remember, like, who are we actually building it for? What are their values and the return on investment for that community, not just what we may assume. Those are great. And then I'll bring over the next question to Sarah. The same question. Sorry for skipping you over, Joe. I said I was going to call you next, and then the picture of people just progressed left to right. So I apologize. Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I can tell a little bit about my research. Most of my time I am really spending on thinking about the ethical and also legal challenges of artificial intelligence in healthcare and also digital health products in general. And I think like when it comes to AI in the healthcare space, it has a lot of potential, but we are not there yet. So it will take still a long time until we really make sure that those products are safe and effective for all people. And here we come to that, what already Mark and Anthony said. We need to make sure that we actually help to improve the healthcare system for all of us and not actually only improve the healthcare system for a specific subpopulation. And here I worry when it comes to biases, because there are so many different layers of biases, and it's pretty complicated how to actually mitigate biases, because the bias can not only be in the data set, the algorithm itself can exhibit bias. We can have a contextual bias, so that if we are using an AI in one clinic, that does not necessarily mean it works in another clinic. And then also the allocation problems, which Mark already addressed, the questions of how do you actually ensure, because if we go into the digital world, not everyone has so far even the tools to use that great technology. And when we are also thinking about lower and middle income countries, here I believe, for example, here in the US, we already created AIs in the healthcare space, which could help other countries already a lot who have like a shortage in doctors. But the problem is that in low and middle income countries, we need to have incentives first to actually build the infrastructure, because right now in the healthcare space, most is still paper-based. So we need to start in those countries to collect, first of all, data, getting everything digital, to develop an infrastructure, to being even able to bring those technology to such countries and to probably the most vulnerable populations, which we could really help with innovation. And I think we could do a better job in finding incentives for researchers to develop more tools that can help all of us and not just specific people.
Yeah, that's great. I completely agree. These are part of what you're bringing out too, is that it's a very diverse field. There are very many questions still have to be asked. And even to begin it all, really, who are we trying to help and what do we have available, which gets back a little bit to Anthony, the context and the sort of participatory work, and Dr. Diaz too, Mark as well, about sort of what are we going after, who's there, and how can we help specific communities. We really need to be thoughtful. Jen, I'll kick it over to you for the next question.
Absolutely. And I just want to echo Sarah's point about developing the database and the structure, especially in LMICs. As somebody who does global health work so many times, I work with partners who just have very straightforward questions and to improve the quality of the care for the people they're serving. And the data is just not there to help them do it. And it really is a place that we need to think about how we can better help those systems. And they're not going to look like ours, but there are ways to improve that data infrastructure. And it really is a needed area. So really just wanted to echo that point. I want to kind of build on one of the things that Anthony had mentioned about involving community stakeholders as another way of, really getting that insight. We know that greater than 60% of health is really driven by things that are outside of our physical health, right? They're underlying social, environmental, and economic factors. And we as emergency physicians know that, the reasons folks come to our door may have nothing to do with their physical health. And we also know that what we bring in our diagnosis, treatment, and our work with patients may not have to do with our medical training. And so as we think about, how do we find solutions, how do we better, integrate things that are unrelated to the medical data, unrelated to the EHR, and how do we incorporate those into our models? I think one way is bringing in that community voice earlier, and I think that was a fantastic point. But I really want to hear, beginning with Anthony and moving then maybe to Mark and then Sarah, what your thoughts are on that, of what we can do as emergency physician, providers, as researchers, to bring in data that's outside of our doors, outside of that medical house. And, if there's any kind of specific tools that you think can help us for actionable change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from my standpoint, a lot of times I'm not an MD, I'm not a medical professional. So some of this will be more related to, how can I, as an NLP researcher, maybe give tools or develop tools that can hopefully, bring about change in some way. So there's really two ways I think that can potentially, from my research, drive actionable change. And one thing is more evaluation, right? So I kind of would deem this like biomedical NLP forensics, or kind of like digging for dinosaurs in NLP field. So basically there's been so many data sets that have been developed, in biomedical NLP. People are extracting information from pathology reports, from EHRs, from social media, medical concepts from social media. And then from these different corpuses, there's been tons and tons of models that have been developed, probably hundreds of thousands of models, right? And so going back again, a lot of times, similar to what Mark says, just going back and understanding what has been done before, can hopefully bring about change, right? I think small studies just about this one data set, this one model, are important, and even large scale studies, right? At scale that measure bias, measure how the model performs for certain groups, what characteristics can affect a certain model, right? Because these models are generating information that I guess would be used in the decision-making processes by medical professionals or medical practitioners. So understanding that, I think, is important. Even other simple things like at the data set level, right? Going back and understanding who actually labeled that data, right? The demographics of the annotators, the demographics of the users, right, of the people that actually created that data. So this could be like, if it was Twitter data, it'd be like, the Twitter users actually, and then we can ask questions like who is left out, right? Who is missing from the data? Who's not represented well? Right. And then so I think there's a lot, like once we can, evaluate more, there's a lot that could be done there. And then again, going back in terms of some type of, bringing about change. I think another area is in terms of better evaluation tools and techniques. How can we make it easier, right, to do this data set forensics, to do this kind of large scale bias analysis, right? How can we make it easier to find biases in real world systems at scale? Because there's hundreds of thousands of like models that are being developed and published every single day, right? As academics, we're forced to publish, and the easiest way to publish is to show my number is bigger than yours, in some sense. So if we can make it easier to find those biases, I think that could help a lot of people, right? And then as we start understanding more, as we do more of these kind of bias analysis, right, we can kind of understand what are the issues with the current systems. And these systems, again, are reporting data to medical practitioners, right? And if we report these biases that this system does not work well for this group of people, that practitioner can take that information into account, and then it can change maybe their day-to-day decision-making processes because of that, right? So in this, it's not necessarily a tool, to kind of solve AI and bias in AI, but it's more about understanding bias in AI and educating, say, medical practitioners about bias in AI so that they can update maybe their decision-making processes to make equitable kind of decisions.
Fantastic. And I love that kind of underscoring, what is our role as the receivers at the endpoint of all this great work? How should we be asking questions? And that it just, we're not just simply receivers, but we will act on it, and we have to, we have to do our due diligence to ask our questions. And I also really love the point, regarding thinking about how is this data, who is, collecting this data, and just the role of the transformation of that data simply in that single step. And I think that's a great question, as we look at these larger data sets, but just really in a lot of the work that we do is that who. Mark, we'll toss it for you. What are your thoughts on actionable change and how we can incorporate these other pieces into what we're doing as?
Yeah, one thing, so Christian earlier mentioned participatory approaches and listening and working with folks from various communities. And I think on top of that, there needs to be, when we're developing different kinds of AI systems, cross-disciplinary collaborations. And this is beyond thinking like someone's focused on natural language processing and they're working, maybe getting insights from somebody who maybe knows a lot about computer vision, like thinking about talk to your local sociologist, talk to your local humanist. These are rich disciplines that have a long history of looking at problems that we are trying to solve technologically. These problems have preceded technological interventions, and I think that there's a lot to learn from folks who have seen this sort of broader historical view of a lot of the problems that we're focused on. And even though in your original question, you sort of alluded to thinking about things beyond medical data, but I think even when we consider the medical data that we're using, there's a rich opportunity to use participatory approaches to think about, are we categorizing people the ways that they categorize themselves? What are other ways that we might categorize them, and which ones are most relevant? And I'm thinking, I guess to sort of pose one example, we're sort of used to specific census categories of race and ethnicity. But when we're thinking about, in a medical context, communities on the West Coast versus the East Coast, or specifically the New York City area, if we want to talk about a Black Latino community here, I'm in New York, so I'm saying here, folks here are going to use different terms and terminology to describe themselves and group themselves, and compared to folks who are on the West Coast, where in New York, you've got a really strong Caribbean presence. There's a lot of Black, Caribbean, Latino folks. On the West Coast, you're going to see a lot more folks who are Mexican-American, Mexican descent. And these are communities that may all fit under the term Latino, but you're going to see different patterns of behavior, different health outcomes. You're going to see things that get lost under just using the term Latino, and finding the right category to use necessarily means talking to folks and understanding like literally what community do you belong to and how do you describe yourself. And so I want to echo Dr. Rios's point about who is in the data, who is annotating that data. I love the shout out to data annotation. That's like what my work is all about. How are people being represented, and does that actually align with the reality that we think or that we're trying to align it with?
I love this theme that's emerging of just kind of beginning where we are, and this idea of a voice in the data. And I think that's an incredibly important one, and one that we really do fail to capture in a lot of the research and work that's happening. So much richness already where we are, and so much more we can do with what we have. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
Perhaps I say a little bit what I see right now in the healthcare space. I mean, especially when it comes, I think a lot about data privacy issues around it, because so with the data collection, I think it's important that we start to share more data and having more diverse data and collecting this data. But we also need to see how can we actually ensure that. So how can we actually manage that? I think through the COVID-19 pandemic, it helped a lot that people came together and made these data pools, and I think that's a good start, but we need to be more. We can do better, because we need to make sure that the data is very diverse, which we are collecting. And then I think another issue is only the data in the medical health electronic health record. That's not enough. That's also this is a very traditional thinking that's our health data, because these days health data, we can get so much information from other data, if that's from Fitbits, wearables, and other technology in devices in homes of patients and consumers. Even some purchases on Amazon and Co. can give you information about your data, your location data, can tell you these days whether you are at risk of COVID-19. And so and I think that's something which we need to see, that not just the data which is in the electronic health records is sensitive data, but there's so much health-related data out these days, and so much apps that are collecting everyday sensitive data from us. And I think what I would like to see, especially in the US, that we start to also make sure that all kind of health-related data, and not just the traditional data, is protected, better protected by law. Because right now, most of the privacy, so the HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act in the US, and it only covers the traditional electronic health records. And so most of the other data, health-related data, which all the technology companies are collecting through apps and wearables, etc., most of this falls completely outside of this HIPAA privacy regime. And there are some states like California, for example, who has the California Consumer Privacy Act now, to jump in to actually make sure that this data is also being protected. But the problem in the US right now is that this is really at the state level, and that means only the people who are living in that specific state get that protection. And I think it would be great to see in the long term that this is on a federal level, that we solve this issue at a federal level and protect all kind of data. But of course, we need to find we need to make sure that we facilitate also innovation, but at the same time protect the data properly.
That's just such a fantastic point about privacy and the regulatory component of it, not just for the pure need to protect that data, but for also how communities feel about participating in those technologies. The idea that somebody is tracking where I am, collecting data based off of my engagement with this or that means very different things to different people. And to be sensitive to that, to, make sure that folks are not missing out, because that data isn't, adequately protected. There isn't adequate privacy, or we're not adequately communicating that, is just such a big problem right now. And so I think that's a fantastic part of the law to really bring into this discussion. I think we're getting close to time. So Christian, I'll hand it back off to you, and Jason, we will wrap up.
Yeah, I see Jason just popped in. Anything we should know before the last, head into this last question, STEM, or you ready for the?
There were just a few popped up in the Q&A that I thought would be of interest. I got to say, this was an incredibly interesting talk, and my mind can't even wrap around how many layers there are. It's like wheels within wheels, webs within webs within webs, and I applaud all of you guys for having the brains to tackle all of this, because I'm a simple-minded person. I can't make sense of it all, but I love hearing about how someone else has worked it out. So thank you. This first question, though, it has got a decent amount of votes. If our data sets are biased, how can we rest assured that the knowledge and algorithms coming out of them are equitable? And I would let anybody answer that if they felt like they wanted to address it.
So I'm okay. I can address the question, like, how can we be sure that the algorithms are equitable? I think the assumption should always be that they're not, because it's not just, even if the data was perfectly balanced across all potential groups, certain algorithms are just going to be better at picking out certain types of information. For example, from NLP, there might be certain type of syntactic properties about the text itself that it doesn't perform well for a certain group, right? So I think that's where it comes back to actually measuring bias and understanding who the systems work for and who the systems do not work for, and so that should be a big part of it. So that way people can make informed decisions, right? If we're using algorithms and it works well for group A, but not for group B, then you can ask them how they identify maybe. I don't know how this would be used in practice, but if you can kind of, when you're using the system, use the results, like bias analysis results, to inform those decisions, I think that's what would be needed, because the algorithms will always be biased. I just don't think we'll ever develop algorithms that are unbiased in some sense of that word.
Anthony, could you quickly define NLP and what you mean by that? For the audience?
So NLP, natural language processing. So basically, like machine learning algorithms that operate on text, basically. It's kind of.
I would also quickly reference over that Anthony had a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association to this topic, and looking at, I talked a little bit with Mark about this as well, looking at specific language use and patterns between subcommunities across like Twitter and flu tracking, which was, again, even the words we use within these data sets and the way that the NLP observes them. And this, again, I appreciate Anthony's expertise here, but like that data set too, you'd say like, this is just what people are using, is what they're putting down. The format in which that's given to us and then the way we've assessed it for the last 10 years effectively changes the way we will view it and how it relates to itself, which is kind of crazy, very meta.
I also want to add something to that question. I think, as Anthony already mentioned, probably we can try to mitigate biases as best as possible, but we cannot say we have no bias, because, I mean, even physicians are biased, So that's also something we need to acknowledge, and that's something also what AI right now highlights and shows us where do we have actually all the biases. So there's also something good that we get like aware now through the technology that we are quite biased and that we need to change that in the healthcare space. I think we need to develop, from a regulatory point of view, we need to develop standards, what is needed, what the manufacturers need to show when they want to bring a product, a medical device on the market. I think that's very important because these standards are not existing at the moment. I think we need to be more transparent with those AIs or digital health medical devices that are used in clinics. What are the benefits? What are the limitations? In which population do they work good? And I believe in the future, adaptive algorithms, if we can ensure that they are remaining safe and effective, they could actually help to mitigate bias over time if we manage to monitor them properly. Because if you use an AI which is not perfect for one subpopulation yet, but is then used in clinics every day with that specific subpopulation, the AI could theoretically learn and become better to treat that population better. But that also, of course, means we need to find a system how we can monitor these adaptive algorithms that can continuously learn without actually getting new biases into the system.
That's a great point. I think my question would be, when you're programming the AIs, how do you program it to not have those biases? I think we've seen that in Amazon's facial recognition and Apple's facial recognition, that they came back as they were biased. And so how do you ensure that the initial creation of AIs is not biased? And then how do you go back and test that?
One thing I think it's important to sort of consider is who you want your systems to work for, and also thinking about. So we've been chatting about bias, but we haven't actually defined it. And there's different ways of thinking about bias, and I think most often in conversation, it is sort of implicitly talked about as equal rates of error across every group. But I want to sort of shout out some recent work by an early researcher, Layla Marie Hampton. She's a PhD student at MIT, and she really poignantly in her work points out that even if a system is unbiased by that measure, meaning it errs equally for folks across different groups, because we live in a society with different power dynamics and within social systems, that means that the cost of a single error to a particular person from a marginalized community is going to be higher. And so we can't limit our discussions of fairness and bias strictly to the outputs of a system, which I apologize. I just complicated your question even more, rather than saying,
which is what I meant by my
get to equal errors. But I'll just echo again what Dr. Rios said, where we need to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of the systems that we use. Like I'm sure I couldn't name a particular medical device off the top of my head, but I'm sure doctors and physicians know what cases or for potentially what types of patients certain tests may not be as reliable. And so it's not to say the system isn't usable until it's, quote, unbiased, but pointing out its limitations helps folks know when they can rely on those outputs or decisions and when they can't.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would also like to segue that into the second question with the upvotes and actually a little bit of future casting here with this group of this brain trust that we have. But that's sort of going like, so where do we go from here? I think we all agree that you can spin your head or you can get caught up in all of the minutia, just like on the innovation side, period. But what are some things that you've learned about or some ways and tools of tackling some of these issues that you feel like we can like start moving towards? Are you aware of any things that will help us? So the question was about, how do you feel about the movement to remove race, sex, and other personal risk factors from clinical decision rules and decision making, like increased specificity versus possible biases? But again, I think this gets into like, okay, so we have our current system. What are some future casting ways you think will be important going forward?
So not to step on toes, because Dr. Diaz, he's the data set expert here, right? But I think as people are developing new data sets, right? There's data statements, where people are thinking about what's in the data, who's in the data, right? So people are starting from the beginning to understand what this model can potentially learn or things that are learned on that data set. Then there's model cards, right? There are standard kind of metrics for bias, right? I put that in quotes because there's a lot of metrics, again, like Dr. Diaz says, Mark says, you know, we can look at like the say false positive rates between different groups, and we can say, okay, we can test that between known different groups with language. We can test that between known different dialects, right? And while this might not be perfect, right, one might weight one than another, at least it gives us a rough idea of where to go. And then, you know, there could be potential ways of building on model cards and also data statements. I think that could potentially be useful. And one I think is storytelling in some sense. So this comes from a lot of like computer human interaction research where they just gather stories on how the system could be used, right? Who could potentially be harmed by the system? Who could benefit from the system before it's really even put into place, right? And this is more of qualitative analysis, you know, and the stories don't even have to be true per se, you know, but it can kind of get the creative juices flowing, you know, in some sense where somebody can actually qualitatively look at it and say, okay, maybe we should wait for this group based on this information, these stories about how the model maybe can harm a certain group. We should weight errors more heavily for that group in some sense, you know. But again, this hasn't really taken hold in the NLP space yet because they're very highly number driven, you know, but I think there could be more evaluation methods and innovation kind of that goes into qualitative analysis, storytelling of potential use cases and things like that, potentially.
Perhaps I add two things. Like, I think it's also important to have like diverse teams because when developing AI systems, digital health products, etc., because I think it helps if you have a diverse team to identify some specific issues and different issues. And I think also education. User education is very important, and especially healthcare providers that are using those systems, that they understand that innovation and what they are using, and also the limitation and benefits of the system.
Super. We're going to have to wrap up pretty quick here. Do you have one last comment there, Mark?
Yeah, I guess to quickly summarize, I would say regulatory measures certainly need to catch up, and to toss out just like a potentially spicy viewpoint. Increasingly, I am against the view of looking to scale and quote unquote universalize various systems. I think every time there is a slightly new use case, we have to be really rigorous in our testing because higher scale means higher potential cost.
Dr. Newberry or Dr. Rose, add one final comment as our moderators here to wrap us up and take us home.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you guys all. I think, again, you brought up some huge, profound wealth of issues that we face. I think the important thing to remember is they're not sort of insurmountable. And I really like that end piece that Mark brought up as well, which also relates to Sarah's work. You know, we can be pushing for legislation. We can actually deal with these at a big scale. But B, to remember that we don't have to automatically use these systems just to provide for everyone all lumped in together. We can actually use them to look granularly at individuals and individual location, subgroups. Like, we can take a problem and continue to break it into its smaller pieces instead of going after it in a sort of Sisyphusian way. I really like everyone's approach. This was wonderful. Thank you guys so much for being with us. Thank
you guys. It was really fantastic. And speaking of teams, hope we all can work together sometime soon.
Yeah, I'll do a little like high five. I don't know who's on the side. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, this was a great panel. I'm so glad that we added it to our agenda here. I will plug their pre-recorded videos as well. Anthony, Mark, and Sarah all have uploaded videos, so you guys can watch those, and they get into more detail about their areas of expertise. So I totally would encourage you guys to go watch those as well. We're going to switch now, so I'm going to go back into your conversation mode. You guys can keep talking amongst yourselves at your table. Our next panel is called Shrink, Grow, or Status Quo, the Future of EM Operations. So we'll be back with them in about 4 minutes or so.